Hello and welcome to the Maya 101 class for the fourth week where we're going to be taking a look at rigging and animation. Now we have a whole lot to cover today, a lot of different little topics that all come together to make all of this happen. So let's go ahead and just get things rolling. So here we are with my fantastic notebook. Now, I have a quick rundown of some things we're going to be talking about today. Not in any super particular order, but hopefully in the order in which we're going to be seeing them, if maybe adjusted slightly. We're going to be taking a look at deformers. We're going to be taking a look at constraints. And kind of as a subunit of that, we're going to take a look at motion paths, which are kind of sort of like a constraint. And of course, we're going to be taking a look at the concept of keyframe animation. Now, this whole thing is really put together because we need to rig a character. And so one of the first things that we need to kind of get out there for everyone to consider is what really is a rig. Hopefully by now you've at least heard of the term rigging. Someone has maybe said it to you at some point, but even if maybe I'm the first person who's ever said it to you, that's fine. Maybe this is the very first time you've ever heard it. But what is a rig? A rig is really just an automation system. To ease the animation process. So that's the way we're going to be approaching this. Now, oftentimes rigs will, for like a humanoid character, they'll have things like skeletons and inverse kinematics and all kinds of stuff that we're not going to get to explore in this particular project. But I don't want, for those of you who have some passing knowledge of rigging, I don't want you to think that every rig out there absolutely must have things like a skeleton or bones or joints or that sort of thing. A rig is just something to ease the animation process. It's just an automation system. Okay, so let's talk about our rig, because the first step of any rigging process, the number one thing you should remember at all times is planning. Always plan your rig. Always rig your plan. It will be much easier if you have a solid idea of what you need your rig to do before you jump into Maya. Before you even open up Maya, if you already know what kind of control you need, things will be a lot easier for you. So what is our animation exactly? What are we trying to do? We have our cherry, and he's kind of our character, or it is kind of our character. And we need it to bounce across a table. So we know we've got some motion. Specifically, we've got bouncing. So we need to have a nice, smooth manner in our character rig that will allow us to bounce our little cherry around. Now, the interesting thing about that is you got to remember that our cherry is actually two separate pieces. We have the body and we have the stem, and we need to move those together as one unit. They're both going to need secondary animation. Now, I don't want to get too technical things, but let's just kind of talk about that for just a minute. Let's talk about primary and secondary animation. Primary animation is probably exactly what you might think it is. Really, in this case, it would just be the bouncing. It is the lead motion, the most important motion. Secondary animation you can kind of think of as resulting animation, or kind of like a side effect. In fact, a side effect is kind of a nice way to look at it. So in this case, that would be things like the cherry squashing and stretching, or the stem waving up and down, which actually leads me to the next couple of points that we need from our rig. We need squash and stretch. And we need for our stem to be animatable as well. So those are the things that we're really looking at here. Okay, so I just want to give kind of a rundown of our approach before we even kind of get into things. So let's take a look at our cherry. So this is a really rough look at our cherry. And we can see it's a bit of a NURB surface, draw some isoparms. There we go. Now what we want is for the body of this cherry to squash down and to stretch. It will help as we bounce our cherry across the table for things to look more realistic in terms of, does it have weight? Does it have a little bit of attitude? Now, granted, cherries don't really squash and stretch. In fact, if you sling a cherry up against the wall, usually it'll burst. But this is kind of a cartoony thing. And we've come to expect it. When something is bouncing along and has kind of a rubbery style motion, then some part of your brain will expect a bit of a rubbery response from its body. So that's kind of where we're going to start. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and just take a look at setting something like that up for our cherry and getting some rigging set up in our scene. Now I'll give you guys sort of a heads up. My goal here today is to get you guys through the process of rigging this character, which will probably take up about the first half of our class. And then we're going to go over the concepts of keyframe animation and get our animation in place for the cherry, and that'll be the second part of class. Specifically, I'm going to be walking you through the actual bouncing motion as well as the squash and stretch. From there, you will be responsible for animating the stem waving up and down, and any other elements you may decide to add in on your own. Of course, I'm not restricting you in any way in terms of anything you might want to append onto your project. If you want to animate a couple other things, I greatly support that. That's awesome. Okay, so let's jump over to Maya. Now, some kind of forethought. I would like to animate forward along the z-axis. And if we take a look down here in the lower left corner of the screen, you'll see our little axis markers that tell us the forward direction. Will tell us which way the z direction is pointing. And that is what we're going to consider to be forward. That is the motion that we're going to give this cherry as it goes from one end of the table to the next. So what I'm going to do is start off by getting my cherry kind of over onto the edge of the table, more or less into its start position, knowing that we can update that later and we can move it around. So I've just moved the cherry over here. I tapped the F key to kind of fly over to it. And there we go. We're pretty much ready to go. Now, I want to also give sort of a rundown of my process and the way we're going to handle this. I'm splitting up the concepts of our rig into two primary groups. On the one hand, we have the ability, well, hang on, let me back up a little bit. Above all, we're going to need something by which we can move the cherry around. That will be very easy. Really, that's going to be one object we parent, and that's that. We are also going to need the ability to squash and stretch. And we will need the ability to animate the stem. The way we're going to be rigging this up in terms of this class, and really beyond the way that I would just generally do it anyway, is we're going to handle this first. And once we've got all of that working, then we're going to get the stem ready to animate. Then there's going to be a problem we'll have to solve in order to sort of tie the two together so that they all behave like one constant, consistent character. So, back over here into Maya. We're going to start, again, with that squash and stretch. Now, I would advise, if I take a look here, I've still got the node editor open. I'm going to just start off by going under Panels, go to Save Layouts, and just switch to a good old-fashioned 4 view. Now, if you look at the traditional side viewport, Z actually points off to the left. I don't really want to handle animation that way, primarily because our animation curves they read to the right, and so I'd like to be able to look at our scene from a left to right perspective. So what we're going to do is go over to the View menu, jump down to predefined bookmarks and choose left side. And this allows us basically the same shot, just kind of flipping our view around so we're looking from the opposite end. Now, I do not need my table here. Currently my table is just sitting at a translate y of 0, so I can just assume that if the bottom of my cherry is seated right at the location of 0, then I'm good to go. I am sitting on my table. So I'm going to select my table and hit Control H. And actually, I notice it's not even named P-plane, or I'm sorry, it's not named table, it's named P-plane 1. Let me fix that. I'm just going to name this T-A-B-L-E, and then press Control H to hide it. All right. Now, our next step is going to be the simplest part of our entire rig. We just need something in place that will allow us to move the cherry around. And let me also make sure these objects are named too. Let's go ahead and name this Geo. I like to use that prefix for geometry. Cherry underscore body. And for the stem, we'll do Geo underscore cherry underscore stem. All right. Now I'm going to jump back over to the perspective view for just a moment. What I'm going to do is create a locator. This locator will be used as our primary control for animating our cherry around. Whenever possible, I prefer not to have to actually select my geometry in order to animate something. Always try to animate by way of some sort of separated or abstracted, if you will, control object. So let's begin by creating that. I'm going to go to Create, come down to Locator. And this just makes a little locator, and really it's a three-way cross that defines a point in space. So I can just use the Move tool and move it over here. If I want to snap it right to the bottom of the cherry, I've got a couple of options. The easiest I can think of off the top of my head is to just press the 4 key to look at my scene in wireframe. And then I can curve snap the locator right to these isoparms. As you might remember from the class when we were modeling everything, this is just a revolved surface. We made a curve and we revolved it around 360 degrees. A NURB surface is in and of itself just comprised of a series of curves. And so we're going to use that to our advantage to curve snap this locator right here to the base of our cherry. You see it just meets right there where all of the points meet. Now if you have the little center square in your Move tool selected, notice you can snap right along those isoparms, which is very convenient. So I'm going to snap it right to the bottom and leave it there. Okay, now this needs to be named before we go much further along. So let's call this Control underscore cherry. This will be our primary control object and what we'll be using to handle pretty much all the animation. Actually, all the animation except for waggling the stem around will be handled right here. Now, I'm a big fan of keeping things nice and neat in terms of our attributes, so we're going to do a few things. First, it'd be nice if we could start our animation off from a location of 0. Before we do anything else to our locator, let's go ahead and go to Modify and choose Freeze Transformations. By doing that, you should see that all of your translates, rotates, and scales are reset. So scale goes to 1, translate and rotate go to 0. Next, let's clean up and get rid of any attributes that we do not want to animate. Think about this. Do we really need to animate the scale of this locator? Do we need to make it bigger or smaller for any reason? No, it can stay whatever size it wants. Locators don't render. They're just a little hidden object that we're going to use mostly just for convenience's sake, and so that we don't have to actually select our real character's geometry. So I'm going to select all 3 of my scale attributes. I do this just by clicking on scale X and dragging down to scale Z. Once I've got those selected, I'm just going to right click and come down here and just choose hide selected. You can also choose lock and hide selected, so those can never be changed, but really for our purposes, hiding is just as good. It just gets those off the screen. They're no longer in the channel box. And as you may recall from our very first day of lecture, the channel box is all about animatable attributes. If we're not going to animate it, we might as well not see it here. Now, as Paul already brought up over inside of BuzzNet, we also do not need visibility. If we want to hide this for any reason, the easiest way would just be to go to Show and turn off all locators so that they're no longer in our way. But we'll certainly need to see that and, well, the other locator we'll end up creating while animating. So I'm going to right-click on Visibility as well and just choose Hide Selected. If you actually need to reset or in any way change the size of a locator, it's generally a good idea to do that by way of local scale X, Y, and Z, and not the actual properties under the transform node that we've already hidden. The reason for that is if you parent any object to a scaled object, you can end up with strange behavior that you're not exactly expecting, because scales will tend to translate down to children, or scales will transmit down to children. We don't want that to happen. So if you'd like your locator to be bigger for any reason, if you just feel more comfortable in being able to select it, you can go ahead and select Scale XYZ and then choose middle mouse to resize it to whatever makes you feel comfortable. So I'll just size mine up to 1.3, just really just for show. When you're done, however, you won't need any of these properties either. So I would select local position X, Y, and Z and local scale Z, hold down the right mouse button, and once again we'll just hide selected. So now the only properties we have left on this locator are just translate and rotate, which is really all we need in order to animate this cherry moving around. How would you unhide such an attribute? Asks Florin. Actually, you can do that by going under Channels. I'm sorry, it's under, where did they hide this? There is a listing in here, and for some, my brain has just totally locked up for just, oh, I'm sorry, Channel Control. Haha! Bring up Channel Control. And here's a list of all of the attributes that you have listed in here. So everything is still keyable, so we would scroll down in here and we would find scale, there's scale XYZ, and you would move those back over. So if I click, notice this says move to the left, that just put them right back. So that's kind of how you would unhide them. Now if we locked them for some reason, then they would be listed here. Now I'm going to select those and put them back over. And there you go, you see they're hidden again from the channel box. Okay, now let's do a quick test. We won't keep this, but what we're going to do is take the geometry of our cherry and the stem, and we're just going to temporarily parent it to the cherry control, just to give you an idea of roughly how this is going to work. So, easy way to do this is to select your stem, select your cherry, then finally select your locator and hit P. Now when you select your locator, you move it around, your cherry comes along for the ride. That's really going to be the primary way in which we'll move the cherry around. So what I want to do is a quick ready check for everybody who's following along to get up to this point. Alright, so let's continue. So here we've now tested out how this control is going to work. Really, we're just parenting our geometry to a locator. It's about the simplest type of rig you can make for something. But we're not going to keep this parenting relationship right now. What is the role of the locator? Is it used only for animation, or it is going to be the way in which we move the cherry around the screen? As I mentioned earlier, I do not think it's a good idea to allow an animator, or even yourself, to move the actual geometry of an object or character around the scene. You need some sort of control object to abstract you away from being able to interact with something. Why? You could accidentally delete your geometry or change it in some way or cause any number of problems that could make it very detrimental or could just ruin your project moving forward. So always, whenever possible, try to animate using some other control, especially for critical objects. So we have a control that we can use to move around. Another thing that will make this a little bit easier is you'll notice the location of the locators right here at the base of the cherry. So as long as we moved that right onto the surface of the table, then we would know that the cherry is nicely planted. If we were moving the geometry, at least by default, in fact, you'll notice right now his pivot point is way down here. We would have to make sure the pivot was moved to the bottom if we wanted to go that route. And also, I just think it's sloppy to allow an animator, or even if you're animating, to really interact with your native geometry. I just wouldn't do it, ever. Okay, so now that we've got that taken care of, we're actually going to break this parenting relationship for the time being. We just don't need it at the moment. We're going to set it back up gradually while we make our cherry squash up and down. So to undo our parenting, I'm going to show you two different ways to do it. If you select your stem and your body, you can hit Shift-P, and that will unparent those objects. Alternatively, you can go to Window and open up the hierarchy. And here you can see we've got our control object, and there's the stem geometry and there's the body geometry, both parented underneath. Just middle mouse drag those away into empty space, and that'll break that parenting relationship. Okay, now we know how to get our cherry moving. It'll just be a very simple parenting setup. Our next step is going to be to set up the squash and stretch that will allow us to create that first critical stage of secondary animation that we're going to be using. To do this, we're going to deploy a deformer. So let's talk briefly about deformers. A deformer is really just an object that changes the shape of another object. A long time ago, I would have told you that it's really just for changing the shape of a piece of geometry. However, Maya has changed a little bit over the years, and you can actually apply deformers to all kinds of things, like even a particle system. You could have a sprout of water particles jetting into the air and then apply a deformer to wrap them around in circles and all sorts of fun stuff like that. The type of deformer we are going to create will allow us to automatically squash and stretch the body of our cherry in a way that maintains volume, meaning as the cherry gets shorter, it's also going to get wider. As it gets taller, it's going to get thinner. So it looks like it'll maintain that same volume the entire time it's in motion. So let's go back over to Maya. It's very simple to add a deformer, but first make sure that you are in the animation menu set, which you can do by pressing F2. Let's press F2 if you haven't. We're going to select our cherry body, go under Create Deformers, and drop down to Nonlinear, and create a squash. That's really all there is to it. Of course, you'll want to test it out probably immediately. The way you'll test it out is by way of the input node. Now here in the channel box you should see inputs and you'll see squash 1. Click on that. Within all of these attributes, you'll see factor. Factor is actually how much you are squashing and stretching, and if you use your middle mouse button to waggle that left and right, you'll see that I'm squashing and stretching the body of my cherry. I want to give a really quick ready check for people to get to this point. Okay, so continuing along, the problem we have currently with our squash and stretch is going to be a little easier to see if I jump over to a side view. Right now, if I select my squash handle and pull down the factor, notice something. Our cherry is actually pulling away from the surface of the table, and that's not going to look very realistic at all. We don't want that to happen. What we want is for the cherry to look like it's squashing down toward the table, not pulling up away from it. So I'm going to go ahead and set my factor back over to 0 for just a moment. And if you have your squash handle selected, get out the Move tool. And you'll notice that the center of the Move tool is about halfway along the cherry. Incidentally, that's also where we are squashing to, is that point. We're not going to change the pivot point of the squash handle. We're actually going to take the entire handle and slide it down so that it rests right on the surface of the table. Of course, a shortcut would be to take the handle and set its translate Y to 0. Now give it another try. Adjust your factor and see what's happening. It's closer, but we have a really weird thing happening with the shape. And it may be a little difficult to tell what's going on, but what's happening is that the top part of the cherry is actually not deforming. If you take a look in wireframe, it becomes even more interesting. The top of our deformer ends before we make it to the very top of our cherry. Notice as we squash and stretch, everything above the top of that handle, everything above this little crossbeam, is not being deformed. So we need to be able to fix that. The way we can fix this is with the high and low boundaries of this deformer. So I'm going to take the high bound and increase it, and I'll push it up above the top of the cherry. So I've got mine set to 1.4. You can also take your low bound and pull it up as well. So I've increased that now to about 0.2. And that will make everything nice and neat along the surface. So a low bound of negative 0.2, and a high bound of 1.4. And now when you play with your factor, you see you're squashing and stretching, but the whole time the cherry is remaining planted on the table. That's exactly what you want. As a quick note, make sure you don't play with the expand property, and here's why. What expand is for is to help you maintain volume. As you get taller, you get narrower. As you get shorter, you get wider. But if expand is pulled down for some reason, then it looks like you're just scaling in the y-axis, and that's not going to be very useful in terms of our effect. Okay. So, we've got that taken care of. Of course, we can already identify some other problems at this stage of the rig. If we take our factor and start to pull it down really far, you'll notice our stem is being left behind, and obviously that's not the type of behavior we're going to be looking for, but we'll tackle that in a moment. Right now what I want to do is give a really quick ready check to make sure that everybody has got this set up. Okay, so now we've got our cherry squashing and stretching, and we're ready at this point to go ahead and get it attached to our locator along with its deformer. Here's the thing, if you're totally new to deformers, this may take you by surprise, but a deformer is not in any way attached to an object. For instance, let me just center up the pivot of my geometry just so I can more easily move it around, but watch this. If I stretch my cherry up and then I grab the geometry and move it, look what happens. You get all kinds of weirdness. And you can actually use that to your advantage in some ways for various effects. Of course, it doesn't help us here. The big thing I'm trying to show off, though, is that this deformer is an entirely separate object, and it needs to stay in its relative location to our cherry in order to be effective. So how do we do that? Easy. We select the cherry body, we select our deformer, and we parent both of those objects to our control. So just select the cherry body and your locator, and then select your control locator. I'm sorry, select the cherry body and the deformer. I think I misspoke there. Then select your control locator and hit P. That way, you can select your locator and move it around, and you'll notice the cherry body and the deformer handle all come along for the ride. Now, we have another problem we need to tackle, and to me that's kind of the whole nature of rigging, is getting an idea of what it is you want to do, and then systematically going through and finding and solving problems until you've achieved what you set out in the beginning, and you've cleaned up all the little things that arose along the way. The next problem we have is really just a problem of convenience. Right now, in order to get to our factor, let's say we're just animating, we've got our control, we're moving it around, how would we go and change our squash and stretch? Well, as an animator, we'd have to stop what we were doing, select just the squash handle, come over here to the the channel box, click on the squash 1 input node, then select our factor, and then change it. And that's a whole lot of work. So what we're going to do instead, actually the other problem with this is you set yourself up by letting somebody select and manipulate this handle. They could accidentally delete it, which means you'd have to go build your rig, or you have to set your squash and stretch back up again. You don't want somebody to be able to do that. So what we're going to do is create a custom attribute on our master control to keep this from happening. Basically, we'll have our very own attribute right after translate and rotate that will allow us to do squash stretch without having to change objects. It's very simply done. Select your control locator. Then go to Modify and choose Add Attribute. Now, I'm going to put a long name of squash stretch, and notice the way that I spelled that. I've used what is called camel casing. The name is derivative of the fact that camels have humps that go across their back. So an all lowercase squash, then capitalize the word stretch. I don't really need to add anything else to this. We don't need a minimum and a maximum for the value. We don't need a default value. Do make sure your data type is set to float, but it probably should have been when you opened up the window. When you're done and happy, click OK. This creates a new attribute called squash stretch, which you can see here. Now, in and of itself, this attribute does absolutely nothing. It just allows you to change a number, and that number is not hooked up to anything. You can think of this like installing a switch on a wall, but not wiring that switch into anything. By itself, the switch does nothing. In this case, I guess it'd be kind of like a dimmer switch. Now, is there anybody following along right now who is not using Maya 2013, who's using Maya 2012 or earlier? Okay, I got one person on 2012. Well, if I did this with the node editor, then Rodan and Kenneth would not be able to follow along, so I'm not going to do this with the node editor right now. But we did talk about the node editor at one point in the past, and I think it'd be really easy for you to see how to make this connection. So what we're going to do is use the connection editor to get these two objects linked up. So here's what I want you to do. Go to Window, General Editors, and open up the connection editor. All right. Now, the connection editor is all about taking one attribute and simply plugging it into another. And here's how we're going to handle that. First, select your control object, your control locator, and click Reload Left. Next, we need our squash handle, but specifically we need the input node for our squash handle. So what I want you to do is start off by selecting your squash handle, and over in the channel box, click on squash 1 and click Reload Right. So, quick review for those who might have missed something along the way. Window, General Editors, Connection Editor. Select your main control and click Reload Left. Select your squash handle, and over in the channel box, click on Squash 1 and click Reload Right. And pay attention to something as well. In the center of this window is this tiny little button that says from this to that. Basically, this tells you that the connection is going to go from left to right, or from whatever's in the left column to whatever you choose in the right column. You can flip this around, but don't do it. You want to see that arrow pointing from left to right now. Alright, now if you scroll all the way to the bottom of your left-hand list right now, you'll see your squash stretch attribute. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see factor. Factor is currently in bold, meaning that we could connect the squash stretch attribute to it. Not all attributes can be immediately connected to one another. The reason for that is that some attributes have different numbers of actual values than others. For instance, take a look at translate, which is, of course, moving an object around a scene. Translate is actually 3 numbers, one for X, one for Y, one for Z. However, our squash stretch attribute is only 1 number. If we tried to plug translate into squash stretch or vice versa, Maya would get confused because it's trying to take 3 individual numbers and plug them into one thing. And that's bad. It won't let us do that. Now, there are ways around this. We could take an average of X, Y, and Z and then plug that average into our squash stretch. There's all kinds of ways around it, but they would involve setting up new nodes in entirely new systems. What you're looking for when you're setting something like this up is as soon as you click on your left-hand value, make sure that whatever you want to plug it into is bold on the right-hand side, and that means it's eligible to be attached. So we've clicked on squash stretch on the left-hand side. We'll now click on factor on the right. And we're essentially done. The connection was already made. Before you close the window, it's generally a good idea to test. So if we select our control object, you can take squash stretch, and notice as you adjust it, there you go. Now, if you're in Maya 2012, or if you don't have the node editor for some reason, hold here for a moment. Everybody else, try this. Click on factor again, and that's going to break the connection, which is what I want you to do. Then go ahead and close the connection editor. Now let's go to Window and open up the node editor. Now, the node editor is going to want you, for the most part, to create nodes, and we're not going to do that. So we need to get our nodes and bring them in here, and here's how we're going to do that. Jump back over to Window and open up the hypergraph. Hierarchy is fine for now. You should be able to find your control_cherry locator. Just middle mouse drag that into the node editor, and you'll see its node appear. Next, we need our squash and stretch handle, but specifically, again, we need its input node. So I'm going to select the squash handle, but here inside the hypergraph, I'm going to click on the Input and Output Connections button, and that'll show all of its connections. This gives us access to squash 1, which is, of course, our input node. Middle mouse drag that into the node editor as well. And I was just asked, is there some graphical representation of this connection other than looking at the new node editor? Yes, there is. This, if you were to show input and output connections for the object in the hypergraph after you made the connection, you would see both nodes and you would see the connection in between the two. Same thing for the hypershade as well. All right, here's how easy this is to do in the node editor. You'll see squash stretch. The output is on the right-hand side. Plug this into factor. You're done. Now you can test it out. And there we go. We have our squash stretch. We have the ability to move our cherry around. The only thing we are missing at this point is the ability to waggle our stem around. What we're going to do now is kind of break away from the concept of rigging up our entire cherry and just get the end of our stem moving. And once that's moving and we're happy with the motion of it, then we'll go back through and we'll attach the two together so that one follows with the other. I do want to point something out though. If, at this point, you were to select your cherry and go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, you will lose your deformer. Now it's possible I should have pointed this out earlier on, but it is good to know. This means that if you have modeled out this really big, complicated character, and you forgot to delete history on the surface, and then you were to go back in and start rigging that object, any of that modeling history you forgot to delete will end up coming along with the rig, which is just bogging down your system. So it's a good idea when you're finished modeling to make sure that you've deleted out your history. Now if we take a look at our stem, the stem has already had its history deleted. I mean, if you want to, you can go ahead and go to Edit, Delete by Type, History, just to be safe. But before we even begin much with the rigging here, let's go ahead and do a quick ready check to see who's up to this point. Okay. So now we're going to rig up the wobble at the end of the stem. It's very easy to set up, but I want you to start off by jumping over into the side view, and not by minimizing Maya. So here in the side view, zoom in. In my case, the stem is kind of sweeping off to the left. My first step is going to be to create a curve, a NURBS curve, that flows right along with the shape of my stem. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and center up my stem just a little bit. So let's create this curve. By now, hopefully, from the class before last, you still remember how to do this, but that's under Create, and go to the CV Curve tool. Now, just click 4 times to draw your curve. So your 4th click should be at the end of your stem. If it's not for some reason, let's say you created your curve and you only made it to here. Doesn't matter. Stop after your 4th click. Then hold down the right mouse button and grab Control Vertices. So go to Control Vertex and then just move those 4 CVs around. What I'm about to show you will be much easier if you only have 4 total control vertices. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to hit the 3 key to smooth my curve out. This does not have to be perfectly aligned to your stem. There is quite a bit of room for play. So in this case, you'll notice mine is it's pretty close and that's all. And really, for me, close is close enough. It'll still work just fine. Let me go ahead and do a really quick ready check for people to have this curve done. Okay, so we've got our curve. Our next step is going to be to select a specific point along this curve, and here's how we're going to do it. Have your curve selected in object mode. Zoom in if you need to, or what I'll often do if I'm having a hard time in a case like this is I'll select the geometry, then hold down Shift and draw a marquee selection box. Shift means I'm toggling, so that deselects the actual object and then it selects the curve underneath. Do we center the pivot on the curve, or is this only on my side? You shouldn't. My pivot is really far away, but the actual pivot of the curve itself is fairly irrelevant. If you'd like, you can go ahead and center it. It's not really going to make any difference to us. It'll be easier for me to center it to show you something, but really its actual transform pivot is not going to be of much use to us. All right, once you have the curve selected, right-click and choose Curve Point. This allows you to select any point along this curve. And what I want you to do is select the point at the far end, at the tip, right at the very end of the stem. Once you have that, go to Create Deformers, and you're going to create a point-on-curve deformer. So let's see. Alexander says, or Paul, you say when you right-click, you don't have curve point. All right. And let me just back up with undo for just a minute. So you have a curve. It's in object mode right now, yes?
Hold down the right mouse button out here in space. What are you getting? What's one of the options you're getting? That's a polygon object. That means you are still looking at your stem, because I can do that too. Yeah, don't hold over the actual piece of geometry itself. Do it over open space. It says curve 1. All right, let's take a look at your screen. Hey, Paul.
Hey. Hi.
Hi there. Okay,
So,
okay, get away from there.
I don't
Put your
really
mouse
see
out in
that.
space like mine was. There you go. Hold down the right mouse button. There you go.
Oh,
You're taking.
that's a
Yeah,
trick.
that's all there is to it. See, when you're moused over a polygon object, Maya automatically looks underneath your cursor and says, "Oh, you must want the components of this polygon object." Which is why when I was demonstrating, I moved my mouse away a little bit.
Oh, I understand now.
Cool.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay. So, once you have your curve selected, hold down the right mouse button out here in space, and choose curve point, and select that curve point right at the very tip of the stem. Once you have that, go to Create Deformers and choose Point on Curve. This creates a locator at the very end of that curve. However, the locator's pivot point is over at the origin, which doesn't help us much. So immediately go to Modify and center the pivot on that new locator and test it out. You'll see what that curve does. Okay. Now I would go ahead and name this locator. Let's call this control underscore cherry underscore stem. Now we've put one deformer on the curve so that this locator can wobble around the curve. Now we're going to put another deformer on the actual stem so that this curve will move the stem around. So it's kind of like a layered effect. We have a locator moving the curve. The curve will in turn move our stem. And here's how we do that. Select nothing. Make sure everything is deselected. Go back over to Create Deformers and choose the Wire tool. Now if you can see your help line, the Wire tool is actually going to walk you through how it should be used. So it starts by saying, select the shapes to deform and press Enter. Next, it says select wire curves and press Enter to finalize the operation. So I select the curve and press Enter. That's it. Now look what happens when you move your locator around. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do before I hand over for another ready check is to clean up my channel box just a little bit. I'm going to take the local scale of this locator and bring it down a bit, just because I felt the size of that locator was a little overwhelming. But then just like our other locator, we can select Scale and Visibility, right-click, and hide those. Take our local position and local scale, and we can go ahead and hide those as well. All right, let's do a quick ready check to see who's made it to this point. All right, we've got our stem all set up, and everything is good to go. We did have one question that actually ended up taking place off camera, and really everything was fine. We just hadn't used the wire tool yet, so everything was still in order, and there's nothing really new presented, which is good. That means I didn't miss something super vital when I forgot to hit record again. So our next step is to solve this problem, and that is that if we squash and stretch our cherry, obviously our stem doesn't come along for the ride. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind about this. One is we've got some chained deformers here. We've got a point-on curve, and we have, of course, our wire tool. If we were to try to just move our geometry, you can get all kinds of weird effects, just like we did when we tried to move the cherry around with the squash deformer. We get some weird stuff here as well. So we don't want to do that. If, however, let me go ahead and back up to here. If we move our curve, you'll notice that the tip of the stem tries to stay locked to that position. If we move our locator, the tip will move. So that tells us we could probably get away with moving the locator and the curve excuse me, at the same time. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to grab our locator, our curve, and our piece of geometry, and we're going to group them. Just go ahead and hit Control-G. And we'll name this. We'll call this group underscore cherry stem. Now, there's still a problem here, and here's the problem. If we bend the stem a little bit and then tap the up arrow key to grab that group, again, tapping the up arrow key with the selection will take you up to group level if that object is grouped. We get something really weird which takes place here. This is called double transformation. It's the reason why we have this weird effect going on with my stem. And that is because of this. Let me go ahead and kind of break it down for you. Right now, here's our rig. And we got a little stem that goes around this, our little piece of geometry, which goes around all this. Currently, our stem geometry is being told to move by the wire deformer, and it's being told to move again because of the group. So it's adding those two motions together and getting double transformation. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. It's very, very easy to fix. What we're going to do is tell the group to no longer have any effect on our object, so that the stem is really only controlled by that wire deformer. So let's go back over to Maya, and here's how we set this up. Select your geometry for the stem and open up the attribute editor. You'll need to make sure you're in the transform node. It's the only node that is actually just named GeoCherry Stem. It doesn't have shape appended to it or anything else. In the window with translate, rotate, and scales, right here in this first group for transform attributes, at the very bottom you'll see inherits transform. Turn that off. Please redo the parenting on the stem, please. I didn't do any parenting on the stem officially. Now, parenting was kind of the end result, but here's what we did. We grabbed everything, really. Just one quick marquee selection. So I had the locator, the geometry itself, and the curve, and I hit Control-G to make a group. And of course, I named that group underscore cherry stem. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and continue. So we've got that moved around. Select your geometry for the stem and switch off inherits transform. That means that no more data that is sent from the group will affect this object. Why is that good? That means if we tap the up arrow key and grab the group, we'll no longer get that really weird deformation. That makes everything work. Now at this point, we have accomplished the following. We've got our squash and stretch working. We have figured out how we're going to animate the stem. Now we just need to be able to tie the two together so that we end up with one nice consistent object that we can move around very easily. The way we do that's going to have to be a little bit clever, because currently our cherry does all of this squashing and stretching. And you'll notice that at the moment, the stem doesn't come along with it. Now, it'd be easy enough to take the group and parent the group to our control. Don't actually do that, I'm just showing you. But we could take the actual control and move it around, and everything looks fine. It looks like it's going to be great. But the moment we do squashing and stretching, that will betray our problem. So we can't do that. Let me undo all the way back so those are no longer parented. Here's what we are going to do instead. Can't we squash the stem too? You can, but if you want to be able to wobble it up and down and not have it look weird, you don't really want to. But I mean, technically, you could. The really nice thing about setting up the rig in this way is you can delay the wobble of the stem a little bit, and it will make the motion look quite a bit more realistic. I'm still getting double transform even with inherits turned off, says Lawrence. So let's take a look at Lawrence's screen.
Hello.
Hello!
Yeah, so I click the geometry. Oh, I can't see because the webinar thing on the one.
No, I see it.
You see it? Yeah, it's unchecked.
Uh-huh.
So when I select the entire group, it's still behaving strangely. Hold on. Yeah, see?
That's not double transform. That actually looks like something else. It probably has to do with the following. Here's what I want you to do. Select your piece of geometry, and let's go back to... Actually, I'll tell you what, move it off to the side so we're getting some of that weird transform, just so we can look at this. Okay, yeah, that's fine. That'll do. Now just select your piece of geometry, and let's go back to the channel box. Okay, expose wire 1. So under your inputs, click on wire 1. There you go. Increase your drop-off distance a little bit. What's happening is that the range of that wire deformer, it has kind of like an area of effect, and your scene is slightly different scale than mine, which is no problem, but it means that the vertices of your stem are not as affected by the wire as mine. So you've got some vertices there. Yeah, they're only getting maybe 50% of the actual effect, or maybe less. And so by increasing that drop off, you're reaching out and grabbing some more of those vertices, so you no longer get that lag. So everything you've got on your end is fine. You just need to increase that drop off distance.
Yes, yeah, that's fine now. Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks.
You're very welcome. All right. Continuing on. The way we're going to attach the stem to the body of the cherry is by way of a motion path. Now, a motion path is just a NURBS curve that another object will be animated along, like a railroad track. I'm going to give you a really quick demo for creating one. You may follow along or not. Just realize we're going to be throwing it away in a moment anyway. Let's go to Create, grab a CV Curve tool, and click, 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 click. Doesn't really matter where you click and what you build. Just build something. Awesome. And for the fun of it, I'm going to take my number of frames and kick it up to 100. The way I'm going to do that is by coming here to the range slider, and taking the second number from the end, and setting that to 100. Now let's create an object to move along this curve. Let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, just make a cube. They're fast and easy to build. Hold down Shift, select my NURBS curve. Now watch this. Go under Animate, choose Motion Paths, and choose Attach to Motion Path. Now if I move my time slider, look at this. That's how a motion path works. We're going to use part of this process, not the whole thing, mind you, but a certain specific aspect of it. Let me show you something. If I grab this curve and start playing with its CVs, I can do something like this. And notice, the object doesn't care. It'll still go right along with that curve. That means this curve could constantly be changing its shape if it wanted to, and it wouldn't matter. The little guy here would still keep following along right with it. That's what we're going to use to our advantage. So I want you to grab your curve. If you did this, grab your curve and your object and just nuke them. We don't need them anymore. We need to create a curve on the surface of our cherry that always moves along with our cherry. And here's how we do that. I'm going to select my cherry, hold down the right mouse button, and select isoparms. You want to select one of these longitudinal isoparms, these ones that go from the North Pole to the South Pole. It doesn't really matter which one. In fact, you can drag a little arbitrary one off in space if you want to, like that. So you get this little dashed line somewhere randomly down the side of your object. In fact, if you do that, it's a little easier to see. Then, once you have that, press F4. That's going to take you to the Surfaces menu set. Once you're under the Surfaces menu set, with that isoparm selected, go to Edit Curves and choose Duplicate Surface Curves. See, the trick is that isoparm was already a curve in and of itself. That's the nature of a NURB surface. It's really just made up of a whole bunch of curves from one end to the other. We just selected one of those curves, and now we've made it into an actual NURBS curve. We can select it, we can do anything we want to it. But check this out. This is the coolest part. As we play with squash and stretch, the shape of that curve updates as well. Can you run through the selection quick? I can't select the curve. If you have a polygonal cherry, you won't be able to follow directly along. No, that's true, because I made a NURBS cherry on purpose. I showed you guys how to make a polygonal plate, but my cherry was actually a NURBS surface. Though, the good news is that if you did, for whatever your reason, for whatever you thought it was a good idea, if you did go ahead and make a polygonal cherry, it will take you probably all of a minute and a half over the next break to make a really quick NURBS cherry. It's a very, very fast process. Does anybody in here have a polygon cherry? Just let me know. Just tell me over in BuzzNet. Fo, why did you build a polygon cherry, man? But I'm not worried about you, Fo. You'll figure this out. You've got this. Alright. So, now that we've got that, here's the way we're going to set up the rest of this. I want you to select your group that has your cherry stem. Also select your curve. It will be easier to select your curve in wireframe. Much easier to select the curve in wireframe. With that, go back to your animation menu set, so press F2. And once you're back in your animation menu set, go under the Animate menu, choose Motion Paths. Now I'm going to go to Attach to Motion Path and just open up the options box, just to be safe. And I'm going to reset my settings, so everybody is on the same thing. Now, we could use the Start Radio button, but we're not going to. All I want you to do is switch off Follow. So turn off Follow. We do not want this to follow the curve in any way. What Follow does is it makes the object rotate around, and we don't want to handle any rotation. So, once you've switched off Follow, click Attach. Oh, and take a look at what we've got here. My little guy is actually flying around, but take a look at where he's attached. Can anybody tell me where it's attached? Give me the word that I'm looking for. At the pivot, that's right, at the group's pivot. Now, obviously, that's a problem. We don't want the pivot of our group to be so far away. And I should have moved it beforehand, that's true. But let me see if this should work. This should do what I want it to, and it's very cool if it does. Yeah, watch this. If I hold down the D key to move the pivot of my cherry stem, watch this. It doesn't really move the pivot at all. It moves the cherry stem in the opposite direction, which is a total mind job if you're not ready for it. So what I'm going to do, it does work though, I use that a lot. But what I'm going to do is just completely undo all the way back to here. Let me grab my group, press the up arrow key. Now move the pivot of your group to the base of the stem. So hold down D, and you can just move that pivot point right there to the base of the stem. And close is really close enough. Once you've got that, then, with your group selected, also select your curve, go to Animate, and just hit Motion Path. We've already set our options at this point, so everything's fine. If it jumps, like mine just did, notice that my time is at 64. At the beginning of your animation, everything should be just fine. But right now, our stem is sliding along the surface of our cherry because of that motion path. That's just the way motion paths work. Our final step is to break that motion behavior because we don't want this to move anymore. Let me give a really quick ready check. Alright, Kiwi's telling me that he never got that curve on his cherry. It's just a part of the process that he missed. So let's go over that one more time. All we did is select our NURB surface, hold down the right mouse button and select an isoparm, which is one of the curves that make up the surface. You can really grab any one of them, but make sure it's one of the longitudinal ones that go from the North Pole to the South Pole. And you can slide this along and pick any one of them. Because really, that's not one big red curve you're sliding around. You're actually selecting different little mathematical curves, kind of like an infinite number of mathematical curves that make up this surface. So grab this. Once it's this little yellow dash, you're going to press F4 to go to the Surfaces menu set. Go to Edit Curves and choose Duplicate Surface Curves. So again, F4 to go to the Surfaces menu set, and under Edit Curves, hit Duplicate Surface Curves. And then you've got that curve on your surface. That's all you missed. And then you can attach your group to that curve as a motion path. Now, it looks like pretty much everybody's got up to this point, or close enough to it. The last step in this case will be to grab your group, and you'll see motion path 1 here. Take a look at U value. All of its properties are set to red, and whenever you see properties set to red, that's because you have a keyframe on them. It means it's animated in some way. U value is what is actually updating to give us motion from one end of the curve to the other, and as you drag the time slider, you can confirm that. What we're going to do is go all the way to the beginning of the animation when our stem is in place, and we're going to delete that animation. So, select U value, hold down the right mouse button, and choose Delete Selected. That's not going to delete the attribute, it's going to delete any animation applied to the attribute. So that now when you move the time slider, your stem stays put. But check this out. If we grab Squash Stretch, our stem just comes along for the ride. So let's give a quick ready check for people to get to this point. Actually, on second thought, we've been going, this is actually a really good stopping point because at this point our cherry is all nicely rigged. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then when we get back, we're going to take a look at the process of getting this guy animated and making him jump up on top of the cake. So that'll wrap up this video, and I'll catch you guys in just a moment.